So good afternoon, everybody. Come on, you all go to church. Good afternoon. Thank you. So my name is Metallian Conde. As Brian said, I work with really the deployment of artificial intelligence systems across society. So before I start, I'm not going to be with you long, but I want to do a couple of things. I'm going to define terms to make sure that we all understand what I'm saying. Oh my God, I am tired. I need to work out more. I'm like catching my breath. So we understand what we're talking about when we think about AI. And then in line with some of the other questions that have been asked around diversity, really speak about an alternative way Black people can be engaged, because I too, as many in the audience, don't really have that much faith in the diversity and inclusion discussion as it's presented, and there are other alternatives. So just to start, do people really understand what's said when we refer to AI or artificial intelligence? And that's fair, because to be honest, the people developing it don't understand it either. So, but what they do have is white skin and the ability to capture money. And that's really where I'm going to start. So the reason that tech solutions are used, the reasons that they're so compelling to our economy, is that you can take the human out of decision making. When you take the human out of decision making, you also take out overhead, you also take out HR concerns and everything that goes along with being an employee. So the brain of each machine that we use, that we think of as being automated, is something called an algorithm. So an algorithm is a statistical model that looks at past data to predict what's going on in the future. The issue is much of the data that is from the past is also embedded with racism and sexism and ableism. You're going to speak about the criminal justice system later, so I'm actually going to speak about banking and borrowing as my example. So if we look at the history of redlining and what that has done for Black wealth in this country, when you go to a bank and they're deciding whether to give you a loan, what they're looking at oftentimes is where you live. They're looking at your zip code. And within that zip code, the number of people that pay loans back. Poor people do not pay loans back. The reason many Black people are poor is because of the way divestment in residential communities that were traditionally Black. People like to say Black or brown, but my work is really grounded in anti-Blackness, so I'm really going to keep the conversation with Black. For people who are Black, many of whom came here through chattel slavery, were not given the opportunity to build the wealth that would pay back the loans. So when these algorithms are developed, they're developed using inputs which themselves are inherently racist. And the determination often is, if you're Black, that you're not going to get that loan or you're not going to get favorable rates, versus if you happen to be white and because of segregation and because of redlining again, you're put into a more affluent data set, right? Because the zip code represents the data set, and that data set is going to lead to a favorable outcome. So what on the surface looks like a statistical analysis, it looks like a neutral. One of my colleagues somewhere in the back spoke about neutrality. So that looks like a neutral decision is encoded with the racism, the sexism, and all the other parts that make us the society that we are. In algorithmic thinking, there is often still human intervention. When we speak about AI, we're actually taking that a step further, because what you're then doing is using those same algorithms, but this time machines are learning from machines, a process called machine learning or ML, and they do not have that human intervention. And with human intervention often comes context. That's why we need diversity and inclusion officers and all of these other people in companies, because they are the ones that will give the context for what's going on. And what happens when you have science without context is that you end up then creating a set of decisions and propelling them into the future that disadvantage women, that disadvantage Black people, that disadvantage people with disabilities. So in AI systems, we see this facial recognition as something I work with a lot. That's an example of an AI system that was developed and optimized for white men. So its recognition rates with white men are around 96, 97%, but it has a 40% error rate if you're a dark person, so that's all people of color. And if you think that it fails almost 40% of the time, I always laugh that it shouldn't really be called facial recognition, it should be called Bob recognition, because the only thing that it recognizes is Bob. But then on top of that, because of machine learning and then what's called deep learning, and deep learning is where the patterning takes place, it's reproducing this set of results, which wouldn't really mean anything if facial recognition wasn't being encoded into automated vehicles. So some of the prototypes I've looked at are using facial recognition for start and stop functions, but unless the technology improves, the car potentially wouldn't stop, which then would make it dangerous, right? That's where the society piece comes in. It's being used by agencies like ICE to identify people that should be deported, which again, if we think that deporting an adult from a family, what that can do. And this is really where the crux of my work comes in. So what do I do? So that is for definitions. What do I do? My job is, so I'm both an engineer, but I'm also a social scientist. And my job is to go in and look at these technical problems and then really speak with design teams and ask them, is this really what we want? My colleague prior spoke about crisis communication as being a D&I function, and I would say that I would sit in that, but what I'm looking for is justice, right? Is this a just technical system? So the bulk of my work over the last year has been in Congress, and I've been advising members of the Black Congressional Caucus over really, when we're looking at regulating technologies, what are the error points that we should be looking at? So some colleagues of mine co-authored a report called Racial Literacy in Technology, which we offer as an advancement to D&I. And what we were saying is, if we look into the literature of sociology, color blindness, this idea of color blindness advances racial oppression. The reason colorblindness advances racial oppression is that when you're colorblind, you're also blind to the solutions that could potentially be brought forth to stop some of these oppressions happening. And what's happening in technological design is when we continue to use the zip code as an input, when we continue to use gender as an input for an algorithm, when we continue to use names. So there was a recent report that I read from Amazon where you're more likely to get a job at Amazon if your name is Bob than any other name. Bob is gendered, right? And what the machine is doing, it's picking up on all the successful Bobs in their recruitment pool and saying somebody with the name Bob is going to be a strong employee. Because you have to remember, these are machines learning from machines. There's no person coming in and saying this is why this might be problematic. So what we were looking for in that report was, how do we interrupt these systemic issues using either technological design or having to use people? And we went out to Silicon Valley, and what we found were race is often not spoken about because people feel uncomfortable, and they feel uncomfortable because usually they don't have a literacy around the fact that these skills can be learned, these skills can be taught, that diversifying your workforce does not mean anything unless you're disrupting power. So having a bunch of, I'm glad that we're doing work with HBCU students, but having low-level Black employees and then making them acculturate to norms that may or may not fit them. If they're talented, they're going to exit the company and they're going to create their own. And if they're not, they either leave or they cannot be and should not be expected to do the work of racial and social justice if they're there to do other types of work. And then the other finding that came out of racial literacy and technology is that there is actually a sector within the tech industry that is looking to solve these problems. So I would call myself a public interest technologist. What happened at the end of last year was the New American Foundation, Ford, MacArthur, and for me, the News Integrity Fund got together and said, as long as the motive is always going to be profit. There isn't going to be justice. And so what we're going to have to do is, just like we have public interest lawyers, we need to recruit people who are public sector technologists, who put people first in the output, but then are thinking about technological design in a way that is going to be socially equitable. So I was a fellow last year at a research institute called Data and Society. I'm a fellow this year up at Harvard, and one of the problems I'm trying to solve is how can I walk into a room and say, what do you know about AI, and everybody put up their hand? And not only everybody put up their hand, because it's not the technical part that's important to me, it's the way that it hits society. People can say the reason that bail instruments are inequitable is that the algorithms within bail instruments are built on racist criminal justice data, or the reason that it's harder to get loans are, or whatever the example is. You can go out throughout society, and they can also push back and say things like, so I was part of a team that entered a facial recognition ban, the first one on the federal level, where we said that this technology that is being introduced is so powerful, we don't have enough regulations, and it disadvantages Black communities more than any other community. We need to ban this as being, in this particular bill, it's based out of New York. They wanted to enter facial recognition devices instead of keys, so you would lose your apartment if you didn't hand in your keys and come through the building. Completely unconstitutional. But we said that that's not a viable application, and the only people that are going to win are the big companies. The other thing that we're looking at are things like antitrust laws, and saying, why do we have massive tech companies and nobody in the middle? Why can't we have a technical middle class where your only viable option doesn't need to be selling to a bigger player? You can make $10, $15 million a year, which is what would be considered middle class in this context, still survive and not have to compete against Amazon. I'm not going to name all the sponsors because you're about to push me off the stage, I'm sure. But not just look to the bigger companies to be able to do that work. And it was really interesting. Lots of backlash from Silicon Valley, but also lots of engagement, because one of the things that we found were other people are actually interested in some of these ideas also. And the reason that it's important, and specifically important to this audience, is that when we think about the creation of these advanced technologies, we're speaking about a 3.5 trillion to 5.8 trillion addition to the global economy. And the project for the US government is, how do we capture that value? And my provocation is that we capture it by embedding justice and equity at the base, and then spreading information to the rest of the populace so that they understand. They understand that Steve Jobs did not code. He was a designer who knew how to work with a computer scientist. They understand that diversity, inclusion, and equity are one model, but there are many others. And they also understand the power of using the public sector and the nonprofit sector to get to solutions that you want, because even in the nonprofit sector, you're speaking about organizations that have $20, $30 million budgets that are coming from foundations because they're answering this question. So do you guys know Color of Change? Like, are people on social media? So for the people that know Color of Change, this is a nonprofit organization that looks at social justice, but they do most of their activations through social media and online. That is a company that has a $30 million budget, really raising money from high net worth individuals and foundations. This is an alternative way that you can be in the tech space. In my introduction, I'm actually in the process of standing up a nonprofit too, because I'm not dumb. And when I saw that budget, I was like, well, I could do something with $30 million real quick. I have the skills, but not only do I have the skills, I also understand the technology, and I understand how to make it just. So in AI for the People, we're really looking at 2020 as our target date, and we're looking at online disinformation and how it's spread through how it's spread through AI advertising algorithms online and creating visibility around that, as well as census technologies. So unfortunately, I have to run for a flight. I'm going to be around for a little while, but not too long. But if you're interested in privacy and online privacy as I am, differential privacy is a threat to the census. So looking at that and then engaging with celebrities, engaging with other people that can help spread this message so that Black communities have the power in their hands in the way of information to decide if and when we interact with technologies, if and when this is the way that we want to make our money, if and when we're going the private route, the public route, the nonprofit route, but to create an industry where there are more entry points. Because in my view, if the only entry point is to go to a hackathon and to become a coder, very many people are going to be left out of what is the story of a technological future that includes all of us. And to my colleagues in diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think we do need to honor the incredible work that has been done. I started my career in Google in that business sector. It wasn't, well, in that vertical, I'll say, I don't know if they'd call it a business sector, in that vertical. And what that did for me was made me realize that the real money and the real influence came if you understood the technology. And if you understand the technology, you can do anything. That does not mean that you have to code. All that means is that you have to build the literacy. And there are people like me who are welcome, who are here, who want you in this sector and want you to be able to find your place. So when people ask me, how do I get into AI? I say make space and take space. Because many of the people who are developing these systems do not know if they work. Venture capitalists do not care about the code. They are speculating on whether your company is going to do 10x, going to do 100x, going to do 200x, right? The idea that you have to be perfect and you have to know what you're doing only applies if you're Black. So in closing, if you are interested in working in AI, then certainly follow me on Twitter. I'm weird about technology. I work on it. I don't like using it. I don't like social media. I like writing notes because I'm so paranoid about technology at this point. But one of the things that I am is that I'm knowledgeable. I have access. I found a way to secure funding outside of VCs, because if I was going to go around begging with a deck, I would never have got funding. But I found in public, we had a dinner last night, and I was saying how the first time I saw any really big money was foundation money. The first $1 million came from a foundation, right? So there are different and alternative ways to get into this work. And if you are passionate about justice, as I am passionate about justice, then I would love to speak to you. So again, my name's Metallian Conde. I am the first and only person in history thus far, and I need more Black women and all people to do this, to enter 3 bills to the House of Representatives around the regulation of technology, algorithmic accountability bill, deep fakes, and then I've spoken at length around biometric data. And the reason that I'm not staying is through this work, I both have a nonprofit, but I consult. I'm going to Frankfurt because Samsung are developing some technologies which they want me to look at. These are opportunities that I would never have got if I was trying to work for a company. And they're opportunities that I would never have got if I wasn't prepared to make white people scared and uncomfortable, because I wouldn't stop talking about race. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, she is quite busy, and that flight to Germany is real. So we are going to have to limit our questions to three questions. They must be questions, not statements, not resumes, questions. We'll take 3. We have the lady here, the gentleman there. What's the first one? We have a lady here. Yeah, she'll need to answer the question. So there is an instruction. You'll have to be loud and proud right now. Oh, I'm loud. I'm sure we got that.
I'm not going to make no excuses, but I have a question. So when you say algorithms, they go over and they see as history goes and folks and speak and make them uncomfortable, that's what we should do, right? Bring in white folks and let them know what the, because I'm gonna speak
So
for
is
a
the
lot of people who want to support but don't understand what a lot of people are going through because they can't hear that. But if you make them uncomfortable and bring them in, that's two parts.
Okay, so is the question about algorithmic decision making, or is it about racial
So
justice?
does that differ? Do you see that differ per region or?
So algorithmic decision making are made of what you can either do big data, which could be the data set of the world, which is 8 billion people, right? You can do smaller data that could be a zip code, 20,000 people. When it comes to demographics, it's usually the history of a region. I'm going to use zip code as an example because it's easy for us to think about our neighborhood. So I'm from New York City. I live in Bed-Stuy. Historically, Bed-Stuy, even though gentrification, I don't know. But Bed-Stuy 20 years ago was largely black. The data that is gathered from there, the life expectancy, the educational attainment, if you think about every single thing that your zip code holds through census data, that is going to be the information that's used to make the decision. So the decision could be, I'm working on an AI in health project right now around kidney failure. The technology is horrible, it's failing, the data sets are horrible, right? One of the reasons the data sets are horrible is one of the inputs that they have in that algorithm is have people's health costs, like healthcare costs, are they defaulting? If then I take that same question and I apply it to the Upper East Side, which is a historically rich white neighborhood, you're going to get quite a different determination. So in terms of what you say, does it qualify by region? Yes. The same with your social media feed. If your social media feed, if your IP address is from Germany, your social media feed is going to look completely different to my social media feed because my IP address is from New York, even though we're right next to each other. The second piece about making white people uncomfortable, I think white people have to have conversations with white people about racism because it's their problem and they have to deconstruct it. What I think black people need to do is really not be scared to tell white people that they need to deconstruct this. We're not the power holders, we're not the decision makers, and quite frankly, Toni Morrison has just passed, and one of the most profound things that she ever wrote is, with racism, it's always going to be something else. I cannot do the labor of making white people anti-racist. I think they should read books. I think they should I think that they should go and worship. I think that they should do those things.
I don't mean racism, but
Sister, I gotta do it. So
Okay.
I gotta make sure we get the other 2 out. She really, truly, and honestly does have a plan.
Thank you, though. Thank you.
Small question before.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. My name is Boucher from San Antonio. My question is, now, I know companies like Dell, for example, they use the TCX survey and participating in equipment where I come out often, test, they ask me questions and get my information. Are other companies doing the same thing to at least alleviate the AI or reading of information? So, for example, I was going through my way here and stuff like that, and while using the wash my hands, it could not sense my finger.
Yeah.
I went to the next one and
Mhm.
found the one that was right behind me, used it.
It's optimized for white skin.
Yeah, so how can we as black people put ourselves in the process of being possible test subjects at least so that they know that they have that information?
So I would recommend 2 things. Rather than going to another company and giving them your input and giving them your data, create the application yourself so that you can reap the value of the IP. Don't just create the application, make sure that you have the intellectual property, then license it. Can't speak to you now, but that's what, yeah, but that's what I would do. The second part was around how can we be part of the That's a really good question. So happened to me last night. Went to a dinner, speaking to some folks from IBM Acquisitions. Because I've done this work, so in order to do the work I do, I had to become an entrepreneur because it was the only time that I would have space. And in the course of me doing these fellowships where I'm taking like a 60, 70, 80% pay cut, and then really downsizing my life to a point because I knew I was making an investment in myself in this family. But in sitting in the seats that I sit in, I now am in community with computer scientists, AI researchers, product people, and I called my homegirl who worked with me on the deepfakes accountability bill. She's a computer scientist. She teaches at Spelman, right? So I call her and I say, how happy are you in your job? And she's like, why? And I tell her about this dinner I had and an application that I can't build, but she's an AI researcher. You can build it. So she's like, okay, cool. And I said, and I even met the person who's going to buy this, and I know the price. So we're speaking, I register the company, I buy the domain. She's writing up the plans for me right now because I have those networks. And so for that initial sacrifice that I made, by the time I got that first check, because public interest technology is still a field that's developing and there's so much money for people who want to be path breakers in that field, and people really liked the work that I had done. By the time I had really got to that first big check, my lifestyle had only been downsized for about 9 months. And I'm now in this situation where I have networks where if an opportunity is presented, there are enough people in the network. So what I would say to people, as in a way that is easy for you, I have many advantages. I'm sitting in New York City where if I need to go and see some person at the Ford Foundation for a check, I can literally just get on the train and go. I realize that we're in Austin, but we are on Twitter and we are in these other different spaces where we can create these radical networks that allow us to develop companies, to develop nonprofits, to think about solutions, to advocate for what we want and what we don't want. I was very scared coming to speak to you guys because I am somebody that wants to disrupt the tech industry and make it more fair and equitable and make sure that Black wealth is within that, which isn't necessarily popular for some of the sponsors, right? But there are certain moves being made by large tech companies that just do not benefit Black communities. And there is an incredible opportunity, not just for civil rights action where it's civil rights and you feel good, but you can actually make money doing good in technology, and that opportunity has never existed. And the reason that it exists now is that our technologies are now undermining our democracy, right? They're failing us. They're invading our privacy in ways that would never have been possible if we didn't have machine learning, deep learning, and AI. And all of those things, as terrible as they are, also present immense opportunity. I tell people every day, if Cambridge Analytica had not happened, I would never have been able to do the work that I've done with Facebook in terms of trying to make them accountable for that. That work is work that I get paid for. So that would be my advice.